Yeah, while we're waiting, I suppose I'm sure you're acquainted with Zoom, but you can private message me as well if you want. If you've got any questions between other people asking stuff, just let me know if you want to say anything. Cool. So I think we're live just now, but we will wait a couple of minutes for people to join, and I'll probably just say a couple of things while we're waiting as well, just about future events. For anyone that's joining, we're just going to give it maybe a minute more and then we'll get started. Just while we're waiting, it's worth advertising future events. This is one of 8, so there's 8 electoral regions in Scotland. We've done 2 so far. This is the 3rd one, and there's 8 in total. So there's another 5 to come, and the next is going to be the Highlands and Islands region in a couple of weeks' time. So there's one every 2 weeks. Cool. Right, I think I'll make a start. So, hey everyone, good evening and welcome to the Future Speaks West Scotland. This is an event that's been organised by 2 groups, Teach the Future, a group of school kids campaigning for more climate education, and sustainability partnerships that are all about connecting different groups and having a conversation. I'm Finlay Asher, I'm the chair for this event. I'm the founder of Green Sky Thinking, which is a YouTube channel and social media platform exploring the topic of sustainable aviation. This event is part of a series of 8 that are going to go around each electoral region in Scotland. We've already had 2. We've had Lothian in South Scotland. This is the west of Scotland. And we've got the Highlands and Islands coming up next, followed by another 4. It happens every 2 weeks, so every Friday at 5 p.m. Yeah, so this evening we're going to be focusing on the topic of the climate and ecological emergency. This is obviously going to be a massive year for climate action in Scotland. So in November later this year, 2021, our country is going to host the UN Climate Change Conference, or the Conference of Parties, aka COP26, which is going to be held in Glasgow. So the eyes of the world will be on Scotland, they'll be on the UK, but Scotland in particular, to facilitate these negotiations and lead from the front with real ambition. Separately, we've got the Scottish Parliament elections, which are happening this May. This will provide an opportunity for Scots to question political candidates about their climate ambitions. And when it comes to climate change, it's obviously going to affect no one more than young people, which is why it's also great in Scotland that anyone over the age of 16 is eligible to vote. So with this event, we've decided to give some of these young voters a platform to meet with local MSP candidates from various political parties and quiz them about their climate promises. So yeah, we've got 3 high school pupils with us today, Hayley, Kyle and Senan, who will be asking questions sent in by young people throughout the region. So what we'll do is we'll start by introducing our high school panelists, and then we'll go around and we'll introduce each politician. So if we can start with our panelists, and Hayley, are you able to just give a little background about yourself, where you're from and why you're interested in this?
Sure. Hi there, my name is Hayley Paku. I'm 16, I live in Clydebank, and I'm the member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Clydebank and Mulgai, as well as the chair of the West-of-Shire Youth Council. I'm really keen to begin this discussion this evening, and I look forward to where it leads.
Thanks very much. Next, can we have Kyle?
Hi, I'm Kyle, I use he, him pronouns. I live just outside of Irvine, and I'm a volunteer for Fridays for Future Scotland and Teach the Future Scotland.
Thanks, Kyle. And finally, Senan, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm Senan Lash. I'm 12 years old and I live in Oban, Argyll and Bute. I've always been passionate about climate change and I'm grateful for this opportunity to voice my concerns.
Thanks very much. So what we'll do now is we'll go around the politicians, and if you could give a quick intro to yourself, which party you're from. So we'll start with Gavin Lundy, who's SNP.
Hi, my name's Gavin. I'm an SNP activist and I'm hoping to stand in the West of Scotland parliamentary region. I previously served as national convener of Young Scots for Independence. And at the age of 24, I very much empathise with everything you're trying to do right now. It's a matter close to my heart as well.
Thanks very much. Katie Gordon next from Lib Dems.
Yeah, I'm Katie Gordon. I am a Liberal Democrat leadless candidate for West Scotland region and the candidate for Clydebank and Mulgai for Liberal Democrats, and I'm also the party spokesperson on economy, fair work and culture.
Great, thank you. Good to have you here. Maurice Corrie.
Good evening. Thank you very much indeed, Whitney. I'm looking forward to this event. Yes, I'm Maurice Corrie, a regional MSP for the Scottish Conservative Unionist Party. I'm the spokesperson and shadow minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Matters in the Scottish Parliament. I do have an interest in environmental matters, and as I say, we look forward to debating that tonight.
Thank you. And finally, Ross Greer from the Greens.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm Ross Greer. I'm Green MSP for the West of Scotland, standing for re-election. I'm also the co-chair of the Scottish Greens. I'm our spokesperson on education and a bunch of other issues. And quite some time ago now, I was a former member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for the Clydebank and Mulgai constituency.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much. So just to explain how we're going to run the agenda today, we're going to have the young panelists, they'll take it in turns to ask some pre-prepared questions. We'll then give each of the politicians a chance to respond one by one. We'll go in alphabetical order, so just the same way I went through there, but we'll switch around who's going first each time. Each politician should aim to answer the question in 1 minute if you can. There'll be a timer that goes off after 90 seconds if you overrun, and I'll also put my hand up 15 seconds before to see you've got a bit of warning. So yeah, if you're still talking, then we'll just ask you to stop and we'll move on. So the event's running till 6:30. So if we get to the end of the pre-prepared questions and we still got time, we'll move on to any good live Q&A questions we're getting. So if you're listening in here, there's a Q&A box. You can enter in there rather than the chat, and our support students behind the scenes will be looking at that, monitoring it, and they'll select some of the best questions and pass them on to our panelists to ask. We'll then finish by giving a chance for each of our young panelists to make a closing statement before wrapping up. Okay, so yeah, let's go on to the first question then. I think we're going to get Senan to go first, if that's possible.
Individual behaviour is heavily influenced by well-designed, engaging and manipulating marketing programs that may not always have the best interest of the environment at heart. For example, in 2019, the sale of SUVs exceeded that of electric cars, a statistic driven by very successful marketing campaigns. What will your party do to improve advertising regulations in order to reduce manipulation in favour of high consumptuous products?
Thanks, Senan. So we'll also just put the question in the chat, so it's there for you to see as well. But yeah, thanks very much for the question. If we can start with Gavin, you can go first, and I'll start the timer. Just remember to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Senan. That's a really interesting question. SUVs is a great example of the issue we're looking at here, in the sense that the reason why that they have become such a successful part of the car market, it's quite hard to explain. And you're right at placing the blame at aggressive marketing, not just in Scotland, not just the UK, but throughout the Western world, throughout Europe and America. We have to take a wee step back and think about the wider context that Scotland is within. Our country has just left the European Union, which means our whole regulatory framework is going to totally change dramatically. And the UK isn't going to be in the position to affect the world economy in a positive way that I think I would like to see us be able to. That's why I was against Brexit for the UK, and that's why I want to see Scotland being part of the European Union. I want to see a regulatory framework which makes such decisions harder to follow through, and which actually can cut the market into such a way that such kind of inefficient trends are a bit hard to sustain in the long term.
Thanks. Thanks for sticking within your time. We'll go on to Katie Gordon next, please.
Hello, Senan. It's a good question. And I suppose the thinking is around how much is hard marketing what makes a difference, and how much is advertising campaigns or cultural kind of encouragement by, you know, well-known people or politicians or things like that. So the kind of a balance. I believe that the Advertising Standards Authority is a UK-wide body. I know from Jo Swinson from Liberal Democrats, she'd certainly influenced it as a backbench MP to change regulations on body image. So it is possible to do, but it'd be a UK-wide level. So clearly we'd want to engage with them on that. But I also think there's a place for Scottish Government campaigns for getting the cultural change we need. It's ensuring people understand the importance of making that change in their own lives, and they can make a difference. So something like the coffee cup levy or the deposit return scheme that we've campaigned for, it's about making people see that you can make these changes personally as well as across the country. So there should be a balance of both, I think.
Thank you. Next up is Boris.
Thanks, Finlay. Yes, I think one of the issues here, I'm a marketing man by my profession, and it's all about getting the right message across. And there's going to have to be substantial aims to change those messages. And you take the coffee cup situation, changes to that. I think people are becoming much more conscious of it, and we need to concentrate and focus on that, and look at the culture campaigns, also promoting alternatives to whatever uses we're doing, whether it be the car or anything else. I mean, I, for example, have now changed from the gas heating systems to all electric, you know, because it's green energy, hopefully, the things like that. We need to look at how we can drill into what the customer wants, the consumer wants. Of course, the suppliers are driven by the demands of the consumer, so we need to get good, positive advertising on alternatives. It's not a difficult thing to do, and with COP26 coming to Glasgow this year, I know myself it's a very good subject to be on, and as I say, my party, as the government of UK, are leading on that.
Thank you. And finally, Ross.
Thanks very much. Yeah, there's a whole load of different levels that we can tackle this on. Some of it we can do from the Scottish Parliament, some of it needs to be done from the UK Parliament, but to pick like 4 things that I think we could do. For a start, we should be taxing these adverts. The UK's tax system is really based around the product or the service that's being sold, not the advertising itself. So there's not much tax on ads. But what we could do is we could set up a tax that goes up on the basis of whatever the environmental impact of that product is. So if BP or Shell want to advertise, the tax on them would be way, way, way higher than on a product that has far less of an environmental impact. When it comes to TV and radio, you can restrict the hours that those adverts are allowed to run on, in the same way that you're only allowed to advertise certain things after 9 o'clock at night. And that's obviously much harder to do. You can't set time limits for social media advertising, but we do need to regulate that as well. Stuff that we can do here in Scotland, though, well, we could set up the tax on adverts here in Scotland, but we should also simply ban the Scottish government from giving funding to the companies who are advertising environmentally damaging products. So the Scottish government gives hundreds of millions of pounds in what it calls enterprise funding to different companies, and that includes marketing funding. The Scottish government actually give money to market to arms companies, not just to companies who cause a lot of environmental damage. We should simply end that. Stop giving them public money.
Okay, thanks. Some really interesting responses there. Thanks very much. What we're going to do is we're going to wait till the end of when we asked you all the questions, and we'll go back to the kids to see what they thought. So what we're going to do next is we're going to move on to question 2, which is from Hayley about fashion and fast fashion.
Thank you, Finlay. The sewing industry had various skills hubs in West Scotland where it was a booming sector. As demand grew for new clothing, as did the need for cheap mass production, which was something that our local communities could not compete with. With fast fashion being highly damaging to our environment and dangerous to those producing it, what will your party do to ensure that sustainable fashion is accessible to the masses and ensure that local industry can thrive in a way that is beneficial to employees and the environment?
Thanks very much. So we're going to start with Katie this time, if that's okay. Just need to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, I thought you were doing it. Okay, so fast fashion, I think there's been a growing awareness in recent years as to the problems of fast fashion and how damaging that is to the environment. And I believe clothing going into landfill is one of the big issues, but there's also the amount of water and energy used in the manufacturing, all of those issues, and the fact of whether it's sustainable, and the fact we've moved away for years from the repair and reuse kind of concept. So what we really feel you could do is to introduce regulations to improve the shelf life of products. So that's about both regulations about the quality of products so that they last longer, but also to support expanding repair possibilities, the repair potential. But there's also things that have been popping up sort of almost from the ground up, things like Depop and other kind of online fashion retail where anybody can sort of start to sell stuff from their own bedroom and sell secondhand stuff. So I know there's growing interest in that kind of thing. So supporting those kind of platforms. We do also need international regulation though, because I think when you're looking at a across the world situation, we need to really be working with the EU and with the UK, which is why rotten that we have left the EU, and equally that shouldn't leave the UK.
Thank you. Maurice is next. Just need to go off mute as well.
having been trained by JP Coates as thread people in textiles and Jaeger and Ladybird, I know the textile industry very well. And I saw sort of what was happening some years ago in the fashion industry. The worry always was about, say, fast fashion. We'll say wear a garment one day and it's either in the jumble sale the next day or it's in the bin. And it's how we maintain that. Again, it's back to consumer choice. And I think it's about trying to get people to keep things longer, to wear them longer. But there is a move happening. There's definitely a move happening in the industry to have that to go on. So it's up to the manufacturers to promote that. And we as the politicians, and obviously those in either in government or in opposition, need to push for these things to go that way. And there is definitely a take up by the industry to do that. So if people are going out to buy clothes, look at something that's sustainable longer than just maybe one season, make it last a bit longer. So it's a duty on all of us really to do that. I mean, I was faced in the industry with some of the leading names in textile retailers where they change their colors every 6 months, every year sometimes, and it goes down. There was a fashion one year of one color, there's a fashion another year. So, I say ask people to wear it a bit longer.
Okay, thanks. Ross is next.
Yeah, thanks. So again, a whole bunch of different levels you can tackle at. One really easy thing that we should be doing is clear labeling on all clothing. So think of the way that food labeling has got much better in recent years. It's much clearer, not just what's in it, but the impact that has on people's health, etc. There should be very clear labeling when it comes to fashion, to clothing, so that we know what's gone into it, what the environmental impact is. One thing that's been proposed, there's a whole range of proposals came from a cross-party UK parliamentary committee on this. Unfortunately, the Conservative government rejected basically all of them. But one of them was a 1 pence levy per item of clothing when it's sold. So small that it's not making an impact on the consumer. So we're not hurting low-income people here. But what that money would do, UK-wide, that would raise about 35 million a year. That money could go into better sorting and diverting of clothes that are chucked out so they don't end up in landfill. We should also be banning these clothing companies from destroying their products. So Burberry incinerate a huge amount of their clothing every year so that they can keep the price up. So there's not a lot of their clothing in supply. And that way they keep their prices up, they maximize their profit, and a huge amount of clothing not just goes to waste, but you then have the damage of incineration. Something that we can do here in Scotland. A couple of years ago, I got Scottish Enterprise, so the part of the government I mentioned there in the last answer that give hundreds of millions to different businesses. I got them to bring in human rights checks before they start supporting a business. But those human rights checks need to be a lot stronger than what they've initially brought in. And we should extend those to the supply chain as well and broaden them to environmental impact. We should also be diverting that money. So it's not just going to big...
Yeah, sorry, Gavin, I think you ran over a little bit there, so we had to, our students took it into their own hands slightly. But yeah, thanks. I think we got your points. Thanks very much. We'll go on to Gavin, who's last.
There's certainly a lot to think about there, and a lot of it kind of comes back to the previous question about personal responsibility and what people can do themselves. And sure, there's a lot we can do to encourage certain type of behaviours which are more sustainable. But ultimately, we have to recognise that clothing is, it's one of the world's largest worldwide industries. We are entirely dependent on Southeast Asian and Chinese products, basically. A lot of these have, serious human rights problems on top of all of the ecological and climate problems that they have. Ross made an interesting point there about how the Tories actually kicked back one of the very easy things we could do to tackle this problem. But unfortunately, the problem there is the UK government. Now, I don't want to keep coming back to this, but we need to be stepping up to the international level and working with our partners in the European Union. Unfortunately, we have a government which isn't keen on doing that, which is why leaving the European Union has been such a great tragedy, because it basically, not being an independent country and tying our hands between our back means that we're really restricted in what we can do here just as a country ourselves.
Okay, I think you're freezing there, but if you finish what you're saying, thanks.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know where I got cut off.
Yeah, I think you'd finished, but yeah.
All right,
thank you. If you're good, thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm good, man. That's not great, man. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. So what we get, that's everyone on fashion, I think. So we're going to move on to Kyle, who's going to ask question 3.
The effects of the climate crisis for those in low-income areas are substantially higher, yet sustainable provisions are few and far between, with it difficult to even carry out the basics of reducing, reusing and recycling. What will your party do to ensure that lower income areas are not left behind in a just transition?
Thanks very much, Kyle. And just a little bit to add to this, I was talking to some people in the area earlier this week that said they have to pay £30 to have their compost bin taken from them, which kind of showed that that's obviously something you might not expect low-income people to be able to afford. So that was a very relevant question. So I think this first one, we're going to start with Maurice, please. And just remember to take yourself off mute, and then I'll start your timer.
Sorry, thank you. As I say, it's very important that we protect people who are low-income earners in society, and that's something that we would want to do and continue to do. We have, overall, as a party and government, we overhauled the universal credit, and obviously there's more needs to be done as a result of the current COVID pandemic. We've learned lessons from that. We've all have learned lessons there across all parties of what needs to be done as we go forward. But I think where we're trying to balance environmental responsibility, which is what we're on about, we do need to make sure that is affordable for everybody, and it's not seen as a tax on anybody, but it's also seen as not a cost either on people on lower income earners, where it's where it becomes a greater part of their income. So we need to get a balance here. And having been a councillor myself in Argyll and Bute Council, I was very, very aware of what we had to do to encourage people to recycle, to be environmentally conscious, and at the same time is not price it out of the market for anybody. So my aim would be to make sure that it's able to be affordable by everybody, and make sure that the governments and local authorities do all they can to sustain that level and not hit people in the lower income area. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we've got Ross.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the reality is it's really expensive to be in a low-income household. It's really grossly unfair, the whole economic system we've got. Some stuff we can do to make it easier, though, for people in low-income households to live more sustainably. Well, for a start, we should be deep retrofitting all council housing, everyone who's in social and affordable housing association housing, etc., because it's often some of the most inefficient housing to heat. So not only is that really bad for the environment, huge amount of energy being consumed, it's also incredibly expensive for the people who can least afford it. So the Greens secured about £10 million to go into a deep retrofitting scheme that started in Renfrewshire last year. But what we want to secure is hundreds of millions of more, roll that out across the country. We should also be changing planning law to make 15-minute neighbourhoods. One of the most expensive things about living in a lot of low-income areas is the stuff you need, the shops you need to go to, they're not close enough to walk or to cycle to. We need to change planning law so that we're actually building communities rather than building isolated housing estates. I know that public transport's key to this, but you've got a question coming up on that soon. Active travel infrastructure, though, again, is key. If we're planning an area, you need to make it safe for people to cycle. We should also be reducing VAT on repairs and maintenance. So it should be cheaper to make an existing building more efficient than to build something new. But VAT on repairs and maintenance is the same amount. It shouldn't be. So we could reduce that, make it cheaper, and that's another incentive, and it will save people money on their heating bill as well.
Thank you. Next up, we've got Gavin.
Okay, so I would probably start by saying that housing is a huge social justice issue which has an intersection with the climate. And the Scottish Government is undertaking a huge house building project over the last few years. And and all of these houses as well are gold standard in terms of heat efficiency and stuff like that. But absolutely, I believe in social justice the same way I believe in climate justice. So any transition has to be a just transition. So the Scottish Government has plans and is putting investment to make sure that can happen. You're talking things like a green workforce academy to make sure that we can take the lessons we've had over the last 25 years and apply them to the next 25 years, and establishing a green jobs and skills hub to cascade that intelligence. So absolutely, I think there's been a lot of investment in that on that front, but I think Ross makes a great point there in terms of and how we link that to very tangible problems like housing.
Thank you. Katie.
I would narrow it down to 3 words. Not that I'm only going to stay 3 words. Transport, heating and food. Totally know that really what it comes down to is, can we provide the financial support to help those on low incomes to be able to play their part in sustainability and supporting the environment. So we do need to make sure that when we are trying to make homes warmer, that the finance is there and that the systems to apply for it or to secure the funding are easy to access. Scottish Government's great at announcing things, but actually getting money out the door is much harder. So we need to make sure it's much more accessible and easy to get that money done. I think from the transport point of view, what kinds of transport are the most likely in rural areas as well as urban areas? We need to make sure we're reversing bus deregulation, because if we can incorporate that and planning on bus transport back into public transport options on a planned way, we should be able to then target the areas where potentially there are poorer bus services to make sure that transport is easier. We need to ensure that cycleways and transport links are really covering most deprived areas as well as the more populous urban areas where lots of people use the transport. And finally, we need to be having good, affordable, locally sourced food. There was a bill in the Parliament, a Good Food Nations bill, which I think was delayed, but I think all parties support it. And we need to be ensuring that's one of the first tasks.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much. Good answers there. So let's go on to question 4. We're going to go back to Senan for this one. She's going to ask a question on transport.
Thank you. West Scotland is a region that comprises not only of mainland areas, but also of coast and inhabited islands. With our region being so spread out, interconnectivity and transport systems are essential to sustain the livelihoods of those in isolated areas. Yet transport is excessively priced, inaccessible, and few and far between in services such as ferries, trains, buses, and cycling provisions. What will you do to make sure that young people and adults are able to access quality green transport and maintain integrated relationships with the West region, whilst increasing accessibility and not having to use polluting private vehicles?
Thanks, Senan. So first up, we've got Ross on this one.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, first thing I'll talk about something that we've already done. Last year, the Greens secured free bus travel for everyone under the age of 19 in Scotland. It was supposed to come in last month. COVID's obviously delayed it. So free bus travel for everyone under 19 will start probably from August of this year, certainly over the summer. Fingers crossed it's a wee bit earlier than August. But I want to expand on that. I want it to include, for a start, under 26s and eventually be free bus travel for everyone. I want to move on from buses to include trains and ferries in that. Fare-free public transport isn't just possible, it's happening elsewhere. In Luxembourg, where they've got a green transport minister in the government, all public transport is now free, and it's made a huge difference, not just for the environment, but for social justice as well. And we need to bring our public transport back into public hands. It's all owned by private companies. There shouldn't be a profit motive here. It should just be about providing a decent public service. What we can do specifically in the west of Scotland, well, we've got a whole bunch of rail lines that really need redualed, a second track put on them. So the Mulgai line, that's the worst rail line in Scotland, needs the second track. I got £5 million for that last year. I need another 20 million to get the redualing done, but we're getting there with that. The Balloch line, that can be redualed. Some of the bits around our Drawson Harbour and Largs, they can be redualed. That'll massively improve the quality of that service. But really basic stuff as well. We need more bike racks at schools. We need to say, if you want to build, for example, an out-of-town shopping centre, you need to fund a cycle path that gets from the town to your shopping centre before you're allowed to build it.
Thank you. Gavin's next.
I think it's a really fantastic question. I think that active travel needs to be a big part of what we're going to do across the west of Scotland. it's a very diverse region, but also it's quite, in spots it's quite urbanised. You have very large urban centres like Paisley and stuff like that. So where we have the opportunity, we need to try and encourage density. We need to try and encourage development, which allows active travel. The Scottish Government has been putting money into supporting that, and I would like to see that continue. If I was personally elected as an MSP, I'd look to try and kick that up a notch. Certainly, I think it's going to be tough. Areas that rely on ferries and stuff, it'll be a long time before they are going to be able to use alternative fuel sources. So we have to make sure that as a national picture, that we meet our commitments in other places, so that we can we have the room to move, so we're not leaving anyone behind.
Thank you. It's Katie next.
Okay, so good question again. I touched on bus regulation before. I think we do need to look comprehensively again at all the cuts that were made way back in the 1960s, so a long time before many people on this call would have been born. But that was when a lot of the train systems were ripped up and got rid of. And actually we showed when we were in government, things like the Borders Railway, you can bring them back. So we should be looking at what train lines can we bring back. Should be looking at things like segregated cycleways. So if we want to encourage more cycle travel, we've got to make it safe again. So I think things like the Bearsway in East Dunbartonshire, in Mulgai and Bearsden, that's an example of a segregated cycleway. You see lots of families cycling on that. I think we also need to think about, what did COVID do? COVID has been an awful experience, but one of the few benefits of it has been the increase in the number of people walking and cycling, and the reduction in cars, until more recently when it started to grow back. So how can we use things like the Spaces for People funding that was there to have pop-up cycle lanes and things like that? How can we make that keep going? And finally, all-inclusive ticketing. Because if we get all this transport and it's still blooming complicated to switch from a ferry to a train to a bus to a bike, it just puts you off. And I cannot understand why we still haven't even got, even in Strathclyde, we haven't got that. So we should be doing it across the country. Okay.
Thank you. Maurice, you're last.
Thank you. That's great. I'm okay, yes, not on mute. Yeah, in the West Scotland region, of course, we've got Strathclyde regional, Strathclyde passenger transport system, and I'm a great believer in using our water transport. We live in the most beautiful Firth of Clyde, and I did a lot of work to bring get the ferry from Kilcreggan to Gourock back into place and organise, and we're now looking at one from there and Gourock to Helensburgh. So there's a move to do that. But my own party in government is actually in Westminster of the UK government is looking at a big review of transport, and also talking about reversing the rail closures that happened under the Beaching Act some years ago, which has been referred to already. So we want to bring back local railways. We want to put the communities connected much better, integrated systems. Ticketing has been mentioned as another one, and also to have good sustainable transport. And it would be a balance between public ownership and private ownership, because we need the investment to do that. And we can't expect the state to provide all that. It needs to be a balance of the two. So I see a great deal for ferries, of course, for our island communities, particularly on the Clyde, the trains on the mainland, and obviously buses as well. But if buses to be powered by hydrogen, that's my aim. I want to see that happening, as I say, and obviously electric where it possibly can be done. I want to bring more piers back into use, and also the fact of bringing that together on the Firth of Clyde. But as I say, sustainability. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. So that's all of politicians have had their say on question 4. So we'll move on to question 5, which is back to Hayley again.
Thank you, Finlay. We have lived through a pandemic. We have personally experienced the consequences of disease. Scientific prediction shows us that this is not an isolated issue. As global warming increases, so too will the likelihood of zoonotic disease within the animal kingdom. COVID-19 taught us a vital lesson in that preventative measures are crucial to prevent further disease. So, what measures, if any, does your party plan on implementing to prevent further global warming and the ecological breakdown of the biosphere?
Thanks very much. So we're going to start again with Gavin on this one.
Okay, so Scotland has set some of the most ambitious targets anywhere in the world. So, for the UK, we're looking at 2050, we're looking at 2045. And just last month, or just in December, we published our climate change plan, which has over 100 new policies looking to how we can meet that target. This is all supported by 1.9 billion in capital funding in the current Scottish budget. To tackle this head on. But ultimately, it's an international question on top of that. So through our role in COP26, as a country, I want to see us, act as leaders and push for the world to go much further. But it's easy to despair about the situation we're in. We're in a very serious situation, as globally. But since 1990, we've got halfway there. We've got a 50% reduction in Scotland, so we're basically halfway there to our goal. So there's a lot of hard work still to be done, but I think there is reason to be positive.
Thank you. Next up is Katie.
Okay, I'm going to focus particularly on the zoological diseases, the biological challenges that you talked about, because I am sure bigger global warming questions will come up in the later on as well. So a big challenge from that, and we think about what was the cause of COVID. Was it the wet markets in China, or what was it? And that whole question about good animal welfare standards is one where actually we do well in Scotland. Scottish farming's got a very good quality product compared to other countries, but we still need to support our industry to decarbonise. We need to decarbonise farming. And I know there's lots of working groups going on with the sector, with academics, with government, to try and look at how to get net zero. So it's not that there isn't a will to get there. We do need to make sure that there's funding to support that, and there's been endless challenges trying to get that funding out of the Scottish Government to pay farmers the replacement funding for us having left the EU. But we also need to think about factory inspections and inspections of animal welfare, because if we're not ensuring that that's funded properly, then all the regulation in the world, if you haven't actually got the support to check it's happening. Okay, very quickly, international collaboration to avoid things like getting chlorinated chicken from America in, and we need to support our farmers to get more sustainable practices. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. No, good summary. So next up is Maurice. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, this is a very interesting question and well put. I think we've learned lots through this COVID pandemic, how the disease started, what we need to do, what we've had to do to try and identify it. I mean, the mass numbers of strains that have come out about it, and it's a balance between public health and epidemiology, which is obviously the research into viruses and things like that. And we've learned a lot as we go along. But obviously, it's going to have to be based, and I agree on this, on international collaboration, where we can actually prevent this happening again. Now, I don't think we're going to be in a position to be able to prevent it happening again, but what we can do is sustain prevention of it, doing the damage it's done with us just now. We go back to the polio vaccine that came in, the smallpox vaccine and others, and the way we got sorted out over Ebola, for example. It's all possible, but as I say, it's all about collaboration, and we need to work together to make sure that this is going to be something that we manage through our lives. But equally, there is a question of responsibility, and also it's keeping people safe in our communities, putting in practices that are safe for people to use and live by, and hopefully that will maintain us going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. Next up is Ross.
Thanks, yeah. Focusing on the point on zoological disease in particular, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this nationally. Yes, Edinburgh as a nation. So, for example, our public procurement processes how we can set much higher standards in school canteens in Scotland, for example, comes from places like Thailand. We could and should be eliminating that, both for the benefit of Scottish farmers, but also because we know that's tied to habitat destruction. We need to bear in mind, though, the climate justice angle here. A lot of habitats are being destroyed, creating the risk of disease, because developing countries want to bring up their people to a standard of living like what we've got. Well, rich countries like ours who've benefited from this for a long time, we should be funding habitat restoration in the developing world, as well as here, we should be rewilding Scotland. But if we fund habitat restoration in developing countries, we create more of a buffer zone between human activity and the natural world where we know there is that risk of cross-contamination. On an international level, of course, though, one of the things we should be aiming for at COP this year is much stronger targets on conservation, not just on emission reduction, which we know we need, biodiversity emergency as well.
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute. Made that mistake myself. So that's everyone finished with that question. So we'll move on to our final pre-prepared question, which is on climate education, and Kyle's going to ask this one.
Those who live in areas in the global south or who are members of marginalised communities are most affected by the climate emergency and will not only be harmed in the future, but are in fact suffering now. This misconception that climate change is an issue of the future is perpetrated through our education system, with merely scientific study being vaguely touched on in the optional subject of science and geography. It is evident that the education system in its current form is failing students to mitigate and face the consequences of the climate emergency. So will your party do to ensure that the education system has a focus on climate change and the environment to equip students for their unprecedented future?
Thanks, Kyle. So Katie's first with this one.
Okay, love your question, Kyle. And I have to say, Teach the Future, great organisation. I know Willie Rennie, our party leader, and our education spokesperson have already met with them several times. We totally support the aims, all the different asks that there are in the manifesto of Teach the Future. And super proud that James Calder, our Lib Dem councillor in Fife, actually put forward a motion that got unanimous support from all parties on supporting all of these asks and pushing the Scottish Government. So that was the first, I think, council in Scotland to do that. So absolutely, we need the education to, I mean, I frankly think that young people have more understanding of this than many of those of us who are slightly older, but it does start with education, but we also need to make sure throughout education. So it's like, we have stuff in the university where I work, which is about decolonising the curriculum. This should be about decarbonising the curriculum. So actually putting it all the way through our curriculum. That's absolutely crucial. We also need to talk in terms of the buildings that our pupils, school pupils are in, because actually we want to make sure that they are also demonstrating that they are climate friendly and that we should be decarbonising our buildings. And Liam MacArthur, one of our MSPs, secured that change in the Heat Network Bill by an amendment. Well, it's kind of an agreement that we should be aiming towards decarbonising the school environment.
Thank you. We'll go with Maurice next.
Thank you, Vinny. Yeah, very interesting question again. I take you back to geography, which is a subject that we've all studied in our careers, in our schools, which wasn't necessarily considered in some years, up until very recently, an important subject, or a mainline subject, in fact, and sometimes was dropped into us from our mid of our secondary schools. I think now it's certainly got to be put top of the agenda, top of the subject criteria, and more people need to study it. And of course, in that, we would encourage them to teach environmental studies, the climate studies, decarbonisation, and all those issues that go on that make up the problems we have in the climate fight that we've got for us. But until we actually make geography a very important subject, we will be slow in picking that up. So I would be encouraging that, and that's what my party wants to do.
Thank you. Ross, are you good to go?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sorry folks, I had a slight connection issue earlier that I was messaging finally, but back now, I think. Yeah, so the Greens support Teach the Future's asks on this one. So one thing that we absolutely want to see is a review of curriculum for excellence as a whole, so the broad general education and the senior phase, to look at how we integrate climate and sustainability education across all subjects. So we can't just silo this. I mean, Maurice is right, I want to see more people take geography, but not everyone is going to be taking geography through their senior phase. So we need to get it in the broad general education. But we need to make sure that no matter what subject you pick, you're getting climate education, which is why it needs to be part of what in most schools is called personal and social education, or it might be health and well-being, or the part of the curriculum that's supposed to be stuff like sex and relationship, mental health, drugs and alcohol, etc. Climate education should be in there as well. It should be considered a core part of citizenship education. What we also need to do is fund teacher training on this. This is pretty new stuff for a lot of teachers. They really want to do more on it, but they don't have the training to do that yet. Teacher training is hard. You need to put a lot of money in because you need to pay for the course and you need to pay for supply teachers. So we would reserve a special fund so that teacher training on that can be set up as well. And it's part of how we would do, I would personally get rid of how we do school inspections, and I would do peer inspections between different schools and different teachers. But part of that new inspection regime should absolutely be how schools are equipping young people for a world of climate crisis.
Perfect, thank you. And Gavin's last on this one.
So I think Scotland's curriculum has a lot of freedom for teachers to take a lead on creating their own classes and their own self-designed curriculum for their own students, which I think that's the way it should be. However, I do recognise, I think that there needs to be a place of a cross-curriculum, cross-school, whole-school approach to climate. Ross touched on, for example, talking about mental health and PSE. I think that's actually a really interesting thing to talk about there. Because I speak to people my age and younger than me who have a lot of climate anxiety, and they are quite concerned about the world that they are growing up in. And I think sometimes we need to think about how young people are going to be able to process the reality that they're living in. But I also think it's important to recognise that young people are leading on this already. And in a certain sense, the current generation of activists, I'm speaking to many of them right now, don't need that help. But I also think that we need to be ready to support the next generation of activists and keeping the fight going.
Perfect, thank you. So I will, I think that's everyone on that list. Just check. Yeah, so what we're going to do now is we will just move on to the Q&A questions. I've been sent it through, so I think I'll just ask it. What we'll do is we'll just try and, if we could answer this one in, I know you're quite good at sticking to time there, actually, we're doing quite good for time, but if we definitely stick to a minute for this one, so just a bit more quick fire, and try and keep your answers succinct. So I'll read out the question. It's an interesting one. It says, given that a rocket launch burns over 300,000 kilograms of CO2, how can your party ensure that Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions usage will fall by 80% by 2050 if the proposed plan for Prestwick spaceport is to go ahead? And how will your party combat the extreme burning of the gases? So if we start with, it was Maurice on this one.
Yes, an interesting question again, and yes, you're absolutely right. Scotland has been bidding for Prestwick, also for Machrihanish and up in Sutherland as well, for these rocket launches. There has been very recently a rocket launched which has got, which is not using a fuel which is going to cause gas problems, CO2 emissions. There is a very big development going on that at the moment, so let's hope that's successful. These are rockets that are fairly small, that put up very small satellites into space, or eventually will. But I think as far as we're concerned is we will want to encourage that new development in the fuel cells that they're using, as much as we're looking at development of aircraft, electric aircraft, where this September will be the first trial run on the run from one of the islands to another in the Shetland Islands with Loganair. So we are very keen that sustainable transport is matched by responsibility to the environment, so it does not affect the climate. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to Ross.
Thanks. Yeah. we don't need to ban rocket launches. We don't need to ban all space travel, for example, because some of it performs a really important good. We know that there are more satellites that we need up there making particular observations for changes in the climate, meteorological changes, and for human safety measures, for example, in the event of an extreme weather event, so that people can be more easily guided to safety. So there are some satellites we need up there. But what we should be clear about is that space shouldn't just be for the rich, which is what's happening already. People like Elon Musk increasingly dominating it. So satellite launches should only be allowed if they provide a clear environmental or social benefit, if they do something good for all of us as a planet. That's not what's currently proposed. What's currently proposed is a free market, free for all, where the rich will get even richer. We should ban that. If Prestwick does become a spaceport, it should not be used for that. It should only be used for space exploration, satellite launches that are in the public good.
Thanks, and thanks for staying within 1 minute. It's good. So let's go on to Gavin next.
Well, listen, I think the space sector is, it's an exciting period of development that we're going through right now, and there's a lot to be picked about. And I wouldn't go ahead and say that we should, totally ban that. We should look at alternative fuel sources and stuff. But the kind of rockets are launching there compared to, a SpaceX rocket and stuff, it isn't quite comparable. But I do agree that unless it's shown to be doing some sort of necessary utility, then we shouldn't be allowing these things to continue on development unheeded. Anything like that has to remain within the Scottish Government's own goals and own framework that we've set for ourselves. Okay.
Thank you. And finally, Katie.
So I'm not sure the relative volume of what is burnt by rockets compared to other forms of pollution, but I do think that the biggest challenge we have is the low-hanging fruit has been sorted. The stuff that is easy to do and doesn't force us to change our habits and isn't costly is being tackled. Where we really need to put our energies into things like the retrofitting of homes, so to make sure we've got warm homes and to ensure we've got sustainable transport. There is money out there. There's money in the Scottish Government's pot. What we need to make sure is that money gets out there into usable, accessible schemes so that it helps us to change behaviour, because the big challenge is about changing culture now, and we need to make it as easy and as accessible and as simple to understand to change not just our behaviour, but what the Scottish Government can do, how we change behaviour through infrastructure, how we change behaviour through things like the transport network. So there's a multi-level approach, but I don't think the pure focus is on the rocket fuel.
Yeah, just as an engineer, I can tell you it's the fastest way you can burn fossil fuel that you can imagine. But yeah, it's quite a niche, but it's becoming more and more prevalent, but it's definitely bad for the environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to go on to Hayley, who's going to ask the next question.
In the west of Scotland, many low-income families rely on major corporations to access goods and services. These companies pay their workers minimum wage, but these individuals are often blamed for using these products and consuming from harmful corporations, despite the lack of alternatives available to them. What will your party do to regulate and tax monopolies which pay workers low wages, yet encourage these workers to buy unsustainable products and redirect society's focus to small, eco-friendly businesses?
Thanks, Hayley. I just want to say on this one, this is a really good question, and it was sent in by a girl called Rhiannon that I had a good chat with earlier in the week. So thanks very much for the question. We're going to start with Ross this time. Ross, you're first.
Thanks. I think this is a really timely question because we got some more news out today about just how terribly Amazon are treating a lot of their workers and a lot of the casualised delivery drivers that they have in Scotland. I think it was a dreadful mistake the Scottish Government made, giving a lot of public money to Amazon to attract them to set up in Scotland. What we should be doing instead, and it goes back to questions, the answers I gave to the first couple of questions, the Scottish Government's enterprise agency gives huge amounts of money to big corporations that should instead be diverted to small local businesses. We should be setting really high standards for these kind of companies, not just if they want to get public money, but if they want to set up at all. If you want to build a factory or a distribution warehouse, one of the conditions should be that you only get to do it if you're paying your workers a living wage, if you're recognising trade unions, if there's no 0 hours contracts, none of these are conditions of the Scottish Government's current Fair Work agenda. It's not really a Fair Work agenda if we're not even giving people the minimum wage that they need to live on.
Thank you. And it's worth noting the girl that put the question in mentioned that there's a massive Amazon warehouse in the area. Gavin Lundy, you're next.
Okay, well, you know, this 37% of the Scottish Government's budget this year, or the current budget, is earmarked for low carbon, for the support of low carbon industry. But certainly I can see, I can understand, totally agree with the concern. I'm sorry, I've lost the question there.
That's all right. So it's just about how big business versus protecting small local businesses.
Well, yeah, I think like there's a lot that the Scottish Government can do to encourage small business and eco business and stuff, and councils can do the same. Ultimately, when you're talking about the question, I think itself mentioned tax, and that's why I was looking for the word in there. The Scottish Government is very limited in what it can do there. With the full fiscal powers of an independent nation, we would have far more choice. For me, climate change is a matter of political priority, because right now we are really limited in what we can do as a devolved nation within the United Kingdom.
Thank you. And it's Katie next.
So is the question really the challenge between big business versus small business, or is it about good business practice versus poor business practice? Because that can happen whatever the size of the business. But it may be about supporting businesses within Scotland as opposed to international corporations that we can't necessarily control. And some of that is to do with international regulation. The EU was doing really good stuff on challenging the big international organizations, but of course we've left the EU. So the big challenge is, how do we manage that now that we're outside it? I think you can use things like business support schemes that change or reward good behavior and can encourage businesses to deliver the appropriate practices and making sure that they are treating their workforce appropriately, they're following regulations. But one last thing, if you do not have the inspection regime to follow up on things like this and things like minimum wage, companies will be able to get away with it. So we need to make sure we both have the inspection monitoring as well as the regulation. Thank
you. Maurice, you're last on this one.
Thank you, Vinny. Yes, and again, another very apposite question. I come from the world of experience, having run factories and businesses and having been responsible for several hundred numbers of staff in various different countries and the UK. And one of my standards was look after people as you would like to be looked after yourself. And that, I think, has a very high standard, and certainly in my case it does. Also, we made sure that we paid the minimum, we paid what at least the minimum wage requirement in that country or in that local authority area or wherever it might be. And so people were fairly paid for a fair day's work. But in most cases, we exceeded that. I think as far as treating staff properly, that is absolutely fundamental to any management and any company that comes across. Yes, there should be ways of inspection. Unfortunately, we don't have enough people to do it. We need to invest in that. We need to make sure it's good business practice. And obviously, I think that will solve a lot of the problems we've got, getting and improving our management of our businesses and our practices. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. Okay, that was the last one on that one. So we'll move on to, I think, Senan, if you got the next question to go on.
Thank you. 2045 does not account for climate equality clearly laid out in the Paris Agreement. As Scotland, we must reach net zero faster than that and true zero before 2045 as well. How are you working to ensure we allow for equality?
Yeah, and this is actually a great question. It's one that when we sent out the survey, we've got a lot of questions on this. Like, the adults are talking about 2050, even 2045. What are they going to do the next few years? So great question. And we'll start with Ross on this one.
Yeah, So 2045 is the Scottish Government's net zero target. That was in a climate bill passed 2 years ago in Parliament. The Greens were the only party who didn't support that bill. We didn't vote against it because that would have been silly, but we abstained on that because the Scottish Government's targets, which they say are world leading, would at best give us a 50-50 chance of stopping runaway irreversible climate breakdown. Morally, I don't think 50-50 is good enough, but 2045 is also a complete distraction because we know that 2030 is the tipping point before the feedback loops get too locked in. So the big focus should be on the interim target, the 2030 target. How much can we reduce our emissions by 2030? Unfortunately, at the moment, the Scottish Government spends way more building new motorways than it does building active travel infrastructure like cycle lanes or improving our rail networks. So one of the things that the Greens did a couple of years ago was we set a target. 70% of all government, what's called capital spending, the money they spend to build stuff, has to be low carbon in the next few years. And we've got a massive plan to transform our railways. But what we need to do is stop the motorway spending right now.
Thank you. And Gavin's next.
Well, I think I'd be quite happy to concede that 2045 might not be ambitious enough, and that's part of the reason why I'm quite interested to see what happens at COP26, because Paris gave us an idea of the scale of the problem, but Glasgow, I hope, will start to provide actual answers on how we can combat that problem. We're doing a lot on planting trees and active travel, locally and local government and Scottish government. But I'd like to see more done, and I also think we just need to step up our international engagement, however we can, right now, because we can't just wait till one day we ever get to rejoin the EU. We can't just wait till the day we get to become an independent country. But essentially, I think we also need to be realistic. So I want to see us be ambitious as we can as a country. But I want those ambitions to be realistic, but I also want them to be concrete. So I hope in the next few months we'll start to get more concrete aims and concrete ways to achieve those aims.
Hope so too. Katie, you're next.
So as the Liberal Democrats, we have always wanted to be as ambitious as we can credibly be. But I did mention earlier, the low-hanging fruit has been tackled. Now, these are not, the targets that we have are not minimum. They're the targets, we have to get to them, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't go faster if we can. But there is so much involved in making those changes. A big part of that is culture. A big part of that is putting regulations in place. A big part of that is the funding to make sure we can achieve these things. You need the combination of all of those together. And it's all very well having big targets and having super ambitious targets, but we actually need to deliver on them. Scottish Government has missed its targets. We need to make sure that we are taking the actions, which is the hard nitty-gritty work of changing regulations, putting in the bills, working out the schemes that are actually going to make the funding go out the door, and changing the culture as well by making it as easy as possible.
Thanks, Katie. Maurice is final one on this.
Thank you, Finlay. Yes, likewise. There's some points there very interesting in this question, and I think we've got to go for 2030. As you know, that's what the key issue is. We're looking at cars being changed. In other words, manufacturers not producing fossil fueled cars from that date onwards. New cars I'm talking about. There is an issue about hybrids at the moment, but we want to see that boost up electric vehicles. So the motorways that are being built or roads that are being built, hopefully will have electric vehicles on it. And eventually by 2045, they should all be like that. Now, I think what we haven't explored properly, and I'm glad to hear our government actually looking at that, is to more investigation and research into hydrogen and the use of that for all our vehicles, including buses in our town centres and everything else like that. But I think, as you say, the Paris Accord has led us to some thinking. We've really got home now on the effects we looked at just now, the blue skies that we've got, and we see that. And I think COP26 will bring some very good answers to the questions we need to answer about our life. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. Okay, so final question. We're going to go to Kyle for the final one.
Scotland has 61% of UK seas, with the Scotland West region having a long, diverse coastline and a vast range of important marine species and habitats. What is your party doing to ensure Scotland's seas are protected and recovered to help mitigate climate change?
Thank you. So we will start with Gavin on this one.
I'll be honest, it's not an area of great expertise that I have on this. Certainly, certainly, I hope that we're doing a lot. I'd honestly have to sit and look into this properly. I know that there was a lot of controversy around kelp dredging and stuff like that before, and I think we came to the right decision on that before. So again, I'd have to look into that more to give a proper answer.
Absolutely, no worries. I think it's very refreshing to have politicians say, I don't know, I'm going to go away, look into it. I think what we'd appreciate, probably look into it and come back to the kids. You can always send them an email next week.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. And I'd suggest looking into sustainable fishing. Katie, you're next.
To be fair, I'm going to give a similar answer because maybe I should have predicted there'd be a question on the seas, but I am not an expert in this area and I don't want to assert things that I don't actually know. The one thing I would talk about in relation to fishing, in relation to what we can see, because that's one area of sustainability. And I just want to make the point that leaving the EU and claiming that this is going to support our fishermen and fisherwomen, and now to find that it's not actually going to work, and that they are livelihoods are devastated. I think we need to actually think about the real people in the end about this. Who makes their living from the seas? How can they do that sustainably? But how can we make sure that we also have enough fish for future generations? I think there have been various different bills on marine life and supporting the marine environment, and I believe they've been relatively cross-party, but I am no expert.
That's okay. As I say, it's very refreshing to hear. We do have a marine biologist going to come and talk to the kids in a few weeks, hopefully, so maybe they can pass some stuff on to you and have a discussion about that. Yeah, so next we'll go on to Maurice.
Thank you. As it happens, it's one of the areas I have been looking at, and I've, throughout my time as the MSP for West Scotland, I've been dealing with Pride in the Clyde, which is something I launched some time ago, and also working closely with the environmental groups around the Clyde Basin and the Firth of Clyde. And one of the things is about removal of plastics from the oceans, which I'm absolutely dead keen on. And obviously some progress has been made into that. But again, it's an international thing that we have to work on, to where these plastics are coming from. Also, we want to make sure we sustain and have sustainable fishing in our seas. And the only way we can do that is make sure that the fish are not getting polluted with the plastics that are coming in from these things like nurdles and bottles and everything else. We get fishing nets and what have you. And I was shown one day in 1 hour, we were shown at the bottom of a surfboard, which was covered in small little particles of fishing net cuts and things, splices, which were there. And that was only 1 hour. So we've got a lot of work to do. And I'm actually passionate about that, to keeping our seas clean and unpolluted and bring pride back to the Clyde.
Good to hear. Ross, you're last on this one.
Thanks. So a couple of things that the Greens have done. Gavin mentioned banning kelp dredging. So that was a Green proposal that was brought to Parliament and passed, again, I think about 2 years ago. We were really proud of that. Really, really important. So dredging is when you basically rip up the seafloor to harvest what's on it. And in this case, it's to harvest kelp. Kelp is really important because it's actually the most effective carbon sink that we've got in Scotland. It absorbs a huge amount of carbon. So kelp dredging was causing an awful lot of damage. So kelp dredging is now banned, although it's still happening in some cases illegally. What we also did was we sped up the introduction of 4 marine protected areas, 4 bits of Scotland Sea that you cannot fish in, that you cannot do stuff like build oil rigs in, etc. One of them off the west coast is the largest marine protected area in Europe. So we're really, really proud of that. More stuff that we need to do, though. We need to get a handle on salmon farms. So the Greens have been pushing really hard to ban any new salmon farms because they cause so much damage. And we need to get a handle on all the illegal dredging that's going on. Every ship fishing in Scottish waters should be tagged so we know where it is at all times.
Great, thank you. So yeah, there's been some great questions and great responses so far. So what I'd like to do now, we've got 15 minutes left. I'd like to just hand back to the panelists, get their thoughts on that, and just so that they can have some sort of closing statements. Hayley, is it okay if we start with you?
Yeah, of course. So I just want to say a thank you for joining this evening. It was interesting to hear thoughts from across the political spectrum. Climate change is a pressing matter, and we can no longer afford to put it on the back burner. Engagement between MSPs and young people is vital, and so I hope this is only just the beginning. With this being said, thank you again, and I send my warmest regards in these challenging times.
Thanks, Hayley. Kyle, you're next.
First of all, I also want to thank everyone for showing up today. It's great to see people from across the political spectrum put aside the differences to talk about a crisis that will affect every one of us. And about the education stuff, I took biology, chemistry, geography and studies, and all I learned about the climate crisis in school was the glaciers are melting. That's it. That's nothing compared to the whole reality of what it is. So yeah, thank you for supporting bringing the climate crisis into the education system.
Thanks, Kyle. Thank you. And Senan.
Thank you for your time. Your responses have been very promising. It has been encouraging to think we are not alone and you will help us fight for our future. But until I see concrete action, my concerns remain, and I will continue to fight for climate action. I am grateful for the opportunity to add my voice today. I am particularly heartened by the passion of my fellow panelists. Together, I hope we can make a much needed difference.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, that's been great. I mean, it's been a great event personally for me, just to hear all of the questions, hear the responses. I think it's been really great to hear us talking through some very complex issues that have complex solutions, let's face it as well, but there's solutions that we need to understand and get on top of. So it's great that we're talking very collaboratively compared to the average political event, right? There's very little finger pointing going on. We're more just being like, how do we solve these great problems? And that's where we need to be at, don't we? As Scotland, as a world, we need to be talking together, sharing solutions. So yeah, I mean, just a couple of thoughts from me. I mean, just going back to question one. We talked about advertising, and it was kind of notable. We were talking a little bit, it was a bit into consumer choice. We need to push people not to do certain things. And it's like, we need to get into that mindset of what do you expect when we're being bombarded with adverts for all of these high consumption, fly this place, buy this big car, eat loads of meat, fast food, fashion, watches. Of course, people act a certain way, and that's not their fault. That's the system that they've been born into. So it's very much an encourage you to think about that system change, and encourage you to think about, like this case of cigarettes. What did we do with those? We decided it was harmful for society, and we really cut down on marketing because that's just effective. So I really think that's a key area of focus. In terms of there was a little bit about personal change there as well when it came to the low income question. And I really think, particularly people in low income families, we can't expect them to be worrying about the climate crisis if they need to worry about where their food's coming from, heating their house, driving their kids to work, or driving the kids to school and getting to work and stuff. So we definitely need to support them through that and be thinking about those people right at the forefront of any of these policies. So I'd really encourage you to think about that. Like, moving on to the next question, yeah, like insulation was discussed there, and that's going to be a big one. It's obviously just a win-win. We're going to put it in our houses. It's going to save us bills. It's going to reduce energy. It's going to provide jobs, which obviously we drastically need this year for obvious reasons. It's worth just having a look at how much tax we pay on petrol and diesel, even if you're a minimum wage worker. A lot of people still flying around in business jets, basically tax, pretty much. Does that seem fair? I'll leave that question to you guys. When it came to transport, there was talk about we need more transport, but it's interesting looking at government projections on this. We're not really projecting buses are going to change much. We're expecting car use to go up, aircraft use to go up, and buses to stay very similar. So if you are serious about public transport, it would be good to see those plans change. And I was talking to some of the kids from some of these areas that unfortunately couldn't be on the call as well. They said, you need to remember about disabled people and about mothers with kids. You know, a lot of buses only have one slot for such people, and often that can lead to anxiety. Often train stations aren't manned. And if we are going to encourage people to do this, we need to think about all stakeholders. And I thought that was a really good message. When it came to hydrogen, a few discussions of hydrogen there. As an engineer, I'm just very keen that if we talk about hydrogen, you need to state green hydrogen from wind or solar, or is it blue hydrogen, which ultimately is coming from fossil fuels and is sustaining that industry. So please, politicians, if you mention hydrogen, be very clear about where it's coming from. Yeah, climate change, I noticed there was some discussion about we're doing really well against our 1990 targets. That's very deceiving. Part of that is because we've outsourced a lot of our emissions. Part of it is because we don't include international aviation or shipping emissions. So a lot of our consumerism, the emissions from that are in another country. And that means that our personal stats as the UK as Scotland, it makes us look a lot better than we really are doing. And I really think this is the year for Scotland to lead from the front. Because it's the moral thing to do, because it's the right thing to do. And it's because I think we've got the innovation, we've got really clever people. We should be proud of that, and we should be leading the way on technology, but particularly on policy. Yeah, so just a couple of things, talking about farming, that's a good area. I'd encourage you, again, I don't want to criticize, I just want to give you ideas, look into regenerative farming. The US has got a task force on this now. It'd be great to learn from some of the stuff they're doing. We talked about chlorinated chicken and concerns there. I'd be more concerned about the soy the chicken are being fed. Are we going to think about sort of looking into any regulations on soy fed to chickens and to other animals and trying to eliminate that? And biofuels is a big one as well. You mentioned zoonotic diseases. A lot of that's deforestation. It's because of meat consumption, and Scotland probably does have lower impact meat than other places. So we could protect our industry by making it more expensive to import meat in, by adding a carbon tax to the shipping, or by sort of cracking down on those soy-fed products that can come from other places, cheap imports that are lower, worse environmental impact than our own products. It was interesting, some of you guys hadn't really thought much about the marine biology. Obviously, as an island country, it is a big thing. Again, I respect you saying we don't know. I would encourage you to go have a look. In particular, mussels are really interesting. Because that's a really low impact food, actually suck carbon into the shells. Why not encourage the mussel industry in Scotland? None of us really eat much mussels, but they're like a fantastic low impact product that's grown here. And yeah, the other thing about marine biology is just what we do with our farming gets into our rivers, gets into our oceans. So it's really critical that we reform the farming sector when it comes to marine biology. So again, I just want to share some of that stuff. And actually, I want to share that the kids I'm working with really are passionate about this stuff, and they're knowledgeable, and they know all of this stuff. So please engage them for ideas. We can't afford to close our eyes. We want to get out and get talking to people. So if you think, I don't know what to do here, definitely talk to the children. That's what I'll say. So on that note, I'll end it. And I think let's end it early. We'll show how the adults how it's done there as well. And I'm sure you're keen to get on with your weekend. But thanks to all of the panelists for asking great questions. Thanks for the politicians for engaging in this process in such a nice way. I want to put a thank to as well just all the kids that are working on the tech behind the scenes that we haven't been able to see, and a particular thank you to St Columba's High School from Inverclyde, who contributed to a lot of the questions that were asked, but unfortunately weren't able to ask them in person. So thanks particularly to them as well. Thanks, guys. And you can all turn off your mics if you want and just say thanks to each other. But
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Lovely to meet you.
Thanks, everyone. Well done. Thank you very much indeed, Finlay.
no problem.